Hello, everyone. Hi. Morning. Hello, welcome. Hi. Ooh. We're going to get started here in just 2 seconds. My name is Forever, like the word. Hi, hello. I use they and them pronouns, and I am not almost anything to do with classics, kind of. The most I have to do with it is this wonderful person sitting to my right, and it's hard to be a part of a classicist's life without it infusing in everything that you do. What I do is I am a sexuality health educator and trainer, and so I am a resident sex ed teacher, but I also work on an LGBTQ specific curriculum. We got a grant from the Office of Adolescent Health, and we've been getting it all, researched and best practiced. And now we're rolling it out, doing conferences, talking about inclusivity versus specific sex ed. And Vanessa invited me to be a part of this discussion around inclusivity. And I'm really excited to be here. I think that's it. Okay, now Vanessa's gonna talk.
Thank you so much, Trevor. Would you take?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
As my best friend just so kindly introduced me, my name is Vanessa Stovall. I just got my master's here actually last year in classical studies with a focus in myth, and going forward I also like studying ancient music. I'm currently applying for my PhD actually here at Columbia, and we will see if I get in another month or so. But at the same time, doing my master's here and being a classicist and being a queer Black woman and all of these things sort of ended up coming together, especially towards the end of my experience here at Columbia. And then last year, as the panelists last night so aptly put it, there was the racist AIA-SCS meeting. And over the course of 2019, I saw both here and across the country, different departments in the field asking these questions around diversity and inclusion and how the field could be more this way. And I was actually just really frustrated and irritated and annoyed by most of the conversations that would happen. Because in my viewpoint, at least, they tended to just ignore large pieces of cultural practice, history, the field of reception in general, and the utilization of classics. But to the most part, I found myself most angry when facing my colleagues who would be so increasingly worried about how white supremacist groups were appropriating classics for their own agendas in the ways that, well, we have to defend classics because they can't represent and stand for this. And it had always been of my opinion that classics were inherently a part of white supremacy, specifically in this country. And I realized that was a hot take. And so a lot of this presentation and talk that I'm gonna give to you now, and then sort of where I want to go with the wonderful workshop that Forever is helping put together, is really to think through these questions in a much broader, much more historiographical way, in a way that we have been trained as classicists, ancient scholars, just studiers of the humanities, ways to engage with these questions more fully. So one of the biggest sort of divides that comes with these ideas of classics, classical reception, is a need to establish categories. Classicists love their clean categories. And I found that it tends to come down to, well, okay, what is classics? What is it actually? And then what are the ideas about classics? Well, what is really the field of classics in and of itself? And then it's yes, what is reception? What does classics do. And so I always see people try to say, oh no, this is a discussion more towards philology, more towards the grammar aspect, more towards the aspect of ancient cultures, rather than no, this is more towards more modern, more reception, more contemporary studies. But my main argument has always been that what classics is in America and how the field operates is inherently wrapped up in the ideology around classical antiquity that emerged in the beginning of this country. The American field of classics is always going to be tainted by its 18th century enlightened neoclassical origins and the active impact that it's engaged to the contemporary. So how does then the field of classics in America become more diverse and inclusive when the history of the field in this country has been defined especially by its exclusivity and whiteness? And I think the second half of that question really can't be ignored. And so that's sort of why I put together the little timeline that I have handed out to all of you, or Kat handed out to all of you, to sort of shed light on the way that events or different things can coincide. And it's also the structure sort of different aspects that I want to talk about. So classics, what it is, what people often argue it is a field of study that has existed for thousands of years, looking at analyzing ancient life in different ways. What I'm going to argue is that something very specific happened in this country with classics, and pretending otherwise tends to be very willfully ignorant of history. And furthermore, this is an issue that I'm bringing up both as an American and as someone who's actively trying to be an educator in American academia, which is many people at this conference also share similar goals. And so this requires us to go back in time to sort of look at the history and a lot of the origins around slavery, around African Americans at the beginning of this country, but also around who had power in this country and the ways in which classics tended to be utilized in that way. So the first sort of person I wanted to flag for everyone, in 1782, Thomas Jefferson was revising his notes on the state of Virginia. And in them, he specifically went out of his way to critique the poetry of Phillis Wheatley. He said, "Misery is often the parent of the most affecting touches in poetry. Among the blacks is misery enough, God knows, but no poetry. Love is the particular oyster of the poet. Their love is ardent, that it kindles the senses only, not the imagination." Religion indeed has produced the Phillis Wheatley. As a side note, he misspelled both of her names. But it could not produce a poet. The compositions published under her name are below the dignity of criticism. The Herods of the Dunciad are to her as Hercules is to the author of that poem, which is a very roundabout Alexander Pope joke that someone's supposed to get. Ignatius Sancho has approached near to merit in composition, yet his letters do more honor to the heart than the head. Phillis Wheatley and Ignatius Sancho were both slaves that wrote poetry in English. And Phillis Wheatley also composed poetry in Latin as well, and were some of the early Black poets in the 18th century. Ignatius Sancho, a British Black poet. And 1782, Jefferson holds immense amount of power. He's not yet president of the country, but he is Secretary of State. But at the same time, he is someone who is upheld as one of the four founding thinkers of this country. I mean, his statue is over across the way in front of Pulitzer Building. But at the same time, quotes like these betray, not only just blatant disregard and the fact that it's clear that there was a need to undercut the achievement of slaves. Voltaire had cited Phillis Wheatley's poetry in arguing for slavery abolition. And so there was a lot of incentive and motivation to prove that peoples of African descent were inherently inferior, both biologically and in the realms of academia. And classics happen to be one of the main ways in which that came about, which then brings us down to our next charming gentleman. In the 1830s, as we're ramping up to the Civil War, a wonderful South Carolina senator named John C. Calhoun famously stated at a Washington dinner party that only when he could find a Negro who knew the Greek syntax could he be brought to believe that the Negro was a human being and should be treated as a man. He's a fun guy, studied at Yale. All of his sons studied at Yale. His father studied at Yale, and that is how he learned classics, which is why having the assertion that, find me a slave who can just know the finer nuances of Greek syntax, that took me and my family generations to sort of accomplish and have this grounded notion of classical study. I mean, it's absurd to me personally, but also it's just sadly very representative of a lot of the minds that have helped form the academic institutions in this country. Fun fact, Yale named a building after him in 1933. But it also establishes a narrative and bias from people who are running the country, like a Secretary of State / future president and a state senator. And with the peak of academic excellence being defined by classical pedagogy, and not just the peak of academic excellence, but if you're saying that you need Black people to understand Greek syntax to believe that they are human beings and should be treated equally, then classics then also becomes the bar for humanity in this country. So this is a lot to just sort of look at and unpack, but I want to also be clear about why I'm talking about establishing this pattern, because I think it is largely absent from discussions around diversity and inclusion. And also, no one wants to say it, but honestly, whiteness in America is a very specific identity that deals with very different ideological pillars, which classics has always been a part of. And so this is important because the other racial minorities in this country were then defined by that standard. So if we don't name that standard, then how can we talk about how diverse groups interact with it? But also, like, I'm talking a lot about white people. Like, what about Black people? And the classics. But thinking about it in that way, with that framework, classics, classical studies, the field of classics, it represents a space where people of African descent were not supposed to be. Like, it was intended that you were not supposed to be there. And it was made law. I mean, it was illegal for slaves to read, period. English, let alone Greek or Latin. And things along the nature of limiting an entire group's access to different levels of cultural production and things of that nature tends to act as surveillance. It tends to put a lot of scrutiny on those bodies and about the activities they should and should not be doing. And so the Black body within classical spaces, especially, is almost inherently suspicious since the beginning of this country, unless it's attached to a white body in some way. And so a lot of these issues around classics in America are very personal, because they are about identity, and a lot of the ways in which identity got codified at the beginning of this country. And a lot of the ways that it acted at the beginnings for people like John C. Calhoun is that classics was a safe space for a lot of white colonial imperialists in this country specifically. And so I like to bring this up, and I like to talk about it, especially around slavery, because I feel like that's also one of the biggest entry points for many students, especially high school students, when they first come into learning Latin. You have to engage with slavery, and different students will always have different reactions to slavery based on how they were raised, based on the education they received about it in their own country. But slavery in the Latin class for me was always such an interesting point of contention. I was very, very lucky to have a wonderful Latin high school teacher who would sort of put her foot down on any BS, but it was always a point in which students would more reveal what they thought about their own ideas of history and the past and themselves, and what that meant to them and their emotions. It was a place where I saw people get incredibly vulnerable. And it was sort of the first like inklings of the idea for me that as a Black woman, classics was sort of one of the last things I ended up doing in life. Like I did Latin in high school, but I did music and then theater for a long time. But I ended up leaving the worlds of music and theater because I felt there was too much racism and I didn't like the way that sat with me. So classics to me was like, oh yes, like in high school, like, yeah, there's some weird like slavery conversations. Other than that, like this is an apolitical field, like it's perfect. Like, oh, I'm gonna be so happy, yay. And that did not happen, which is why I'm here now. Like, trust me, no one more than me wanted this field to be apolitical. Like, if it was, like, I'd be so down and like championing that. And so, but then as I got like further into the field going later, I realized like slavery is still stressful to talk about. That's because adults are really bad at talking about American slavery, period. And that's always one of the biggest points where I see like disagreement in the field of just like, no, we can't compare American slavery to like ancient slavery because like racism, color, like the ancients just didn't have that. We don't know what to do. And I have also found that incredibly short-sighted, because if you would ask me what the key difference between ancient and American slavery is, I would not say the aspects of colorism that got like turned into a structure of racism. Instead, I would say that one of the biggest differences between American and ancient slavery is that in American slavery, slaves were limited to very specific spheres of production. And they weren't allowed to read and write except under very specific circumstances. And so when you have a slave body, like in antiquity, that deals with not only agricultural production, but also cultural production, like books, but also every aspect of society, you get something more of like how people would describe caste system. But when instead you cut off people from producing in a dominant culture, well, this is how countercultures are born. This is how Black culture is like known as like its own sort of subculture under American culture, which is always such an interesting thing for me, because it's like, I don't know, ideas of American culture seem so generic, mainly because like I think about food. It's like food, of course, that's how everyone shares culture. Like, what's American food? Food we've appropriated from other places, hamburgers, like hot dogs, teriyaki chicken, pizza. But then it's like the other like American food that's stereotypical is soul food. So it's like, oh, right, well, we have these two. And there's like lots of, I mean, there's a long history between dominant American culture and how Black culture has responded to that. But there's not been a lot of attention paid to a lot of the Black cultural responses to classics and the classical tradition. And unfortunately, a lot of this has to do with a lot of the rhetoric that was pushed around Black people teaching themselves Greek and Latin, especially in the 19th century. Many scholars, Black scholars, took Calhoun's words to task. Scarborough and Crummell being some of the most notable ones, saying like, oh, well, like we will be Black men who like publish books on Greek syntax, so they're irrefutable. And then there's like, of course, responses from people in the Black community who are saying like, why should we have to do this? Like, we should utterly reject this like very colonial-like narrative. But a lot of the ways in which Black people studying Greek and Latin got rebranded, in a sense, especially in the early 20th century, tended to be around the ways of, oh, well, Black people just want to be white, and that's why they do these things. Of like, which is a lot of things that Black people would often do to survive were rebranded that way. Black women straightening their hair so they wouldn't get discriminated against in the workplace was always called like, oh, well, Black women just want to be white, as opposed to Black women often get fired from their jobs for wearing their natural hair or braiding it or doing it in any way that doesn't look white. Luckily, last year, New York City finally ruled that it is illegal to do that from now on. But sadly, many other cities, it is not. Ooh, sorry, lost my place. I was thinking about hair. Right, back to cultural production, slavery, and the difference, and why we get, instead of things like caste systems versus countercultures. But I also think it is like very important that there was like differences in cultural production at the start of this country, because I think that's something that's not something that's given or not something that's shine a light on a whole lot. And I think like comparing the differences in cultures can be something useful, especially in studying ancient antiquities, where we like to look at subsumed cultures that have been colonized and how they rebrand their identities under, especially Roman Empire, one of the big ones. But also, like, this is one of the biggest reasons why the relationship between texts and slaves, between ancient cultures and American cultures, is so hard to compare. I was like, I forgot I added in this side. More along the notes of white supremacy. In the past 2 weeks, I've seen many of my colleagues similarly being very worried about the recent ruling that all upcoming future building projects would be done in the neoclassical style, which everyone's like, what does that mean? And I'm like, look in the city that we live in. This is always how buildings have been built. So what are we really critiquing? We're critiquing the continuation of it, but then why don't we look back and critique what is already there? And so we now come essentially to the crux of the issue. People in the field either want to address a lot of the cultural problem in American classics, or they don't. They either want to actively work to deal with it, or they want to ignore it. But it is something that needs to be addressed. For those who would like to address this issue, I offer to please consider the counterculture that has been developing in this country the entire time. Otherwise, this is going to get into a bit of a Cassandra complex. Cassandra is a figure, was a Trojan princess who was a prisoner of war, taken back to Mycenae by Agamemnon. One of the most notable things about her, though, was that she was cursed by the god Apollo to always prophesize the truth, but no one would believe her. And so that's sort of the point that I find myself in, and I've also spoken to other Black classicists in the field who feel similarly, where we feel our voices, we are trying to speak to things that exist and trying to shed light on patterns and paths to answer the questions that our colleagues are so desperately asking us specifically because we look a certain way. But then it's like our answers and our insights completely get ignored. It feels just very performative and like vision centric. It's like it's not really penetrating into sinking in or making impact. And so there's so much to consider of Black classical reception in this country. The first, Phyllis Wheatley, thank you, Black female pioneer, worked with Myth, love her. But I'm only going to focus on one strand of reception because otherwise things will get too hairy and prickly for me, and that's mythic or literature depictions of Persephone by Black female authors. Novels too. I'm sorry, Rita Dove and Gwendolyn Brooks. I had to cut you guys out for time. And so I'm going to be talking about Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, and The Color Purple by Alice Walker. These books deal with themes of racism, misogyny, sexual violence, dehumanization. So if at any point anyone feels like they need to leave the room or take care of themselves for any reason, please do. So why Persephone did I choose? Persephone is very personal for me. She was the first goddess that got me into Greek mythology. I read a picture book about her at age 9, 3 months after I'd had my very first pomegranate. I freaked out because I was just like, oh my gosh, I love pomegranates. I'd be in hell. This is bad. And so, but also, all 3 of these books I encountered in some way during middle and high school. And I did not realize they were about Persephone at the time, but I had so much very white, heteronormative male reception of Persephone, and I really loved her and was like obsessed and trying to like figure out more. But in the background, I also had these, just like this handful of decades of Black queer female reception of Persephone. And the 2 in my head, like the ideas that like emerged from these 3 books were always clashing with like some of the areas where I felt too comfortable in a lot of the other reception of Persephone that I had read. And so that's sort of where the title of this whole talk came from, towards classical reparations, womanist approach to inclusive classical pedagogy. Third of those 3 authors, Alice Walker, coined the term womanism in 1983 in a series of essays called In Search of Our Mother's Garden that I'll actually read the definition for you right now. But I only have it in book form. Find out online. Womanist. 1. From womanish, opposite of girlish, i.e. frivolous, irresponsible, not serious. A Black feminist or feminist of color. From the Black folk expression of mothers to female children, you act in womanish, i.e. like a woman. Usually referring to outrageous, audacious, courageous, or willful behavior. Wanting to know more and in greater depth than is considered good for one. Interested in grown-up doings, acting grown-up, being grown-up. Interchangeable with another Black folk expression, trying to be grown. Responsible, in charge, serious. 2, also, a woman who loves other women, sexually and or non-sexually. Appreciates and prefers women's cultures, women's emotional flexibility, values tears as natural counterbalance of laughter, and women's strength. Sometimes loves individual men sexually and or non-sexually. Committed to survival and wholeness of entire people, male and female. Not a separatist, except periodically for health. Traditionally universalist, as in, Mama, why are we brown, pink, and yellow and our cousins are white, beige, and black? Answer, Well, you know the color race is just like a flower garden with every color flower represented. Traditionally capable, as in, Mama, I'm walking to Canada and I'm taking you and a bunch of other slaves with me. Reply, it wouldn't be the first time. 3, loves music, loves dance, loves the moon, loves the spirit, loves love and food and roundness, loves struggle, loves the folk, loves herself, regardless. 4, womanist is to feminist. That's purple, it's lavender. So, I don't know about y'all, but maybe that sounds like the opposite approach to classics as this country might have been taking for the past 250 years. And so a lot of my colleagues asked me, like, how do we deal with all these like white male supremacist, these things? I was like, well, hey, here is the opposite of all of that. Maybe we could come at it from this approach instead. One other thing that I just really, really like that also occurred around the same time, which is why I threw it on the timeline. Persephone is such an interesting figure, but so much of her reception especially is primarily through Ovid and Claudian's account of her, and which are very paternalistic accounts of Persephone. And that's because the Homeric hymn to Demeter was not rediscovered until 1777 in a barn in Moscow. And so this like very, very new sort of version of Persephone and like her relationship with her mother had just sort of emerged at the beginning of this country and slowly has been coming back into the zeitgeist, and then was really brought forward by Helen Foley, actually, here at Columbia in the 70s. But I more kind of wanted to throw it on for like flavor, sort of like broad historical things are happening, like across the ocean, like there's like another sort of like aspect of like classical womanhood coming out. We'll tie back in later, but yeah. So these 3 women talk about Persephone together in traditions that overlap, like around themes, around style, around manner of presenting. But it's not just engaging with each other literally. These 3 women have very much more stronger personal relationships with each other as well. I'll get further into. Also, traditions around Persephone are very, very old. The Eleusinian mysteries, going back to actually Mycenaean times, were the first archaeological foundations at Eleusis. Sorry, I was just the Eleusinian mysteries at Eleusis, right? So worship of this goddess who represents death, rebirth, agriculture, have been happening and going on for thousands of years. And so having 3 Black female writers in their own tradition doing this. So it's both something very innovative that's happening in this country, but at the same time, historically, it's a part of like a much longer, like, of course, like women paying tribute to Persephone, like in a group over decades. Like this is something women have done historically for thousands of years. So Zora Neale Hurston first gives Persephone treatment in Their Eyes Were Watching God. Her protagonist is Janie, who is a mixed race Persephone. She's a quarter Black. And she's looking back on the years and giving an oral account to it to her friend Phoebe. And she speaks of 3 different relationships with 3 different men that she has, and arguably increasing metaphysics of Hades and trying to sort of figure out the aspect of being tied to another person and negotiating that. But at the same time, she also has to navigate her womanhood and how that has defined her. Morrison next gives Persephone treatment in the bluest eye. Here instead, Persephone is a young Black girl named Thecla, who's one of the most vulnerable and neglected members in her community, who's been sexually abused by her father and who is homeless at the beginning of the novel. Thecla is always defined by the colorisms of gender in America, pulled together in essentially the avatar of the classic blonde hair, blue-eyed, pink-cheeked doll. The doll itself sort of represents an idea of gender that Thecla will never be able to reach because the ideals of gender have been codified into a specific color spectrum. And how Thecla sees color, but also how her color is seen, is essentially the structure of the entire novel, as she longs, or she imagines that her life would gain the appreciation and access she wanted if she had blue eyes. Alice Walker gives Persephone treatment third in The Color Purple, which is an epistolary novel centered on the protagonist, Celie, who falls in love with her unnamed husband's blues singer lover, Sugar Shug Avery. Multiple Persephones are overlapped in a narrative of highly chromatic characters, pun intended, including a Diotima type called Sophia. Over the course of Celie's near 100 years of living, women strongly center the novel and the actions of women strongly center the narrative and the actions of the novel as they attempt to work together in their lives to deal with the structures of marriage and patriarchy and systemic racism. In all three of these novels, there's a progression around sight, color, and gender that each heroine has to consider. First, there is the fair-skinned Jane who finds herself having to negotiate the structures of gender and race as a quarter mixed woman who loves men, but who is constantly recontextualized in their worlds by gender, and who ultimately has to side with white female allies against her dead lover's Black male friends who are accusing her. This resonates strongly with Hurston's own life, where she accounts that she had to read an account of Ceres and Persephone at Barnard in order to gain the favor of two white patron ladies, who she later in her works would often allude to as Ceres figures that she had to go back to. Then comes the dark-skinned Thecla, who loves the idea of white femininity that her society has constantly fed to her entire life. It is ultimately destroyed by its simultaneous inaccessibility and pervasive nature as she continuously faces trauma. Finally, Celie comes into a narrative where she is firmly set in her role and ideology until she blooms into her own being through decades of female community despite constant male intervention, and inevitably attains self-actualization understanding or self-actualized understanding with the other women she's loved throughout her long life. And so in all three of these novels, these three authors have been expressing something I've been calling Black Persephonic poetics. I'm still working on that. I don't know how I feel about it. Where they express these a lot of these like similar overlapping themes through the three novels. Barrenness and blissful plenty, which are very strong. Emphasis on the Blackness of the earth, multisensory sensuality, alternative colorisms, oral tradition, remixing of kin titles, and all of these sort of themes and poetics that are being engaged are ones that like show up in ancient authors. And they're ones that like we often try to talk about, like, yeah, like Gaia Melina, the Black Earth, like what do they like really mean like by that? But it's like if we're only taking and thinking about like, oh, well, what would our founding fathers have thought what the classics mean by the Black Earth, rather than let's look at like what this countercultural tradition when they talk about the Black Earth while they're engaging with classics, maybe this can help us shed new insight. And also, we want to get really specific and just be like, all right, like talk about people in antiquity who need some more new or fairer treatment. I think especially Alice Walker, and a lot of the ways she uses color and fragments in the Love the Letters Celie writes throughout the book. I think there's an ancient author, who's female, who's into other females, who's often described by her presumably paler male colleagues as swarthy or maligna. And that is Sappho. So I think that at the same time, like, taking a more womanist approach to classics would also help, like, some of the voices who've had to deal with, like, a lot of, like, rewriting and, like, miscontextualizing over centuries because of things like misogyny, homophobia, just not liking the plucky little fast talking, singing, she might rap. Like, there are so many perspectives that, like, you could bring to Sappho, but, like, we haven't, because only, like, very elite men have had opinions on her until recently. And so, also it's really fun. I'm currently trying to do a color purple, some of Sappho's frags, along with, like, Janelle Monáe. It should be good. Is that right? Like, color purple, pink, like, Porky Lofron. Like, yeah, it's all in there. It is. So right. Where was it? Yeah, and so, but yeah, it's like I also, like, became more convinced, like, as I was rereading these books for this talk, and I was rereading Sappho at the same time. I was just like, wait, like, they're engaging, like, similar poetics. It's like, you know, all these, like, male authors talking about Sappho, like, why can't she just say words right? Like, why is she, like, using these weird forms? Why can't she? Why? But yeah, we guess she's a genius. Like, and like, but, and so, yeah, so maybe taking a stronger, more womanist approach to classics will help not only strengthen our field and, like, in being more inclusive and diverse, but also it just makes us better scholars and gives us more avenues in which to engage with the ancient world, which is something I want to do. And if others don't, then they should say that, be upfront about it. And so I want to give 2 special shout outs for Poetry Persephones, In the Mecca by Gwendolyn Brooks and Mother Love by Rita Dove. Also, I want to give a shout out to some of the other really, really big popular mythic figures that Black culture has done some great things with. Medea, Niobe, Icarus, Oedipus, Aeneas, all get strong treatments. Odysseus, wow, I didn't write that, I just realized. In conclusion, when we are asking how this field can become more diverse and inclusive, we have to name the voices that we want to include and why, because much of the history of this field has been centered on excluding specific voices. It's not a theoretical query. That's why I'm here arguing for you that we should take a more womanist approach and look at Black female literature, not just because I'm a Black female classicist, and that does certainly help, but also because it really is a neglected avenue in reception studies, particularly in looking in the area, in the realm of press groups utilizing classical education for broader systemic change. And so in order to become, which is what everyone say we want to do, we must first acknowledge. And I want to end with 2 quotes, one from Alice Walker and one from Toni Morrison, sort of as cautionary around. First one is from Alice Walker speaking on womanism, and the second is on Toni Morrison speaking on Western influences in African American literature. So Walker states, "When I offered the word womanism many years ago, it was to give us a tool to use as feminist women of color in times like these. These are the moments we can see clearly and must honor devotedly our singular path as women of color in the United States. We are not white women, and this truth has been ground into us for centuries, often in brutal ways." And Morrison writes, "Finding or imposing Western influences in/on Afro-American literature has value, but when its sole purpose is to place value only where that influence is located, it is pernicious. These approaches can lead to an incipient orphanization or the work in order to issue its adoption papers. They can confine the discourse of the advocacy of diversification within the canon and/or a kind of benign coexistence near or within reach of the already sacred texts. And so, as we go forward, I think everyone needs to be very specific in the ways in which we do things, how we are trying to open up spaces, if those spaces are safe in the ways that we are doing it. And I think that just going forward, a lot of privilege needs to be acknowledged in a really strong way from everyone, myself included. Let me acknowledge some right now. So I am speaking to you right now on the island of Manhattan, one of the least accessible places in this country, honestly. And I'm also speaking to you on Columbia's campus, which is also highly physically inaccessible. It's also often emotionally can be very inaccessible. I can get into deeper ways in which I think that it offers sort of like a cult neoclassical front in that way. I'm also speaking in Hamilton, probably one of the most least accessible buildings on campus, with the smallest elevator and a 45-degree wheelchair ramp. So I definitely need to look forward in conferences I do in the future of thinking through, especially physical accessibility, a lot more, because I'm very privileged in that way. But also it just like transparency about, or everyone having transparency just makes work and education and learning and growing together that much easily. And so I hope you guys want to be more transparent and to move forward in the future in much more grounded and encouraging of solidarity path. That was not a great ending. So that's
How much time do I have?
About 40 minutes.
So I didn't think that this would be the hardest part, but I think this is the hardest part where I say, ooh, like, now Vanessa's going to sit down and be a part of this discussion. And I think you should just hit her up on Twitter if you have more questions. She's very responsive. I acknowledge that many of y'all maybe don't have the privilege of picking her brain as much as I do. And so saying that you're not going to do that right now is more difficult than I thought. For some new folks who walked in the room, my name is Forever, like the word. Please call me Forever. I answer to it even when people aren't talking about me. So, and I use they and them pronouns. And okay, here's how I was thinking about this, but then also I was trying to listen to Vanessa. Cool. I am a sexuality health educator, and like for more transparency, I work for Planned Parenthood in the education department. And so like when Vanessa invited me to this conference, I was just like, what does that mean? I've only been to a sex ed conference, which I'm thinking is really different than what's happening right now. So I was just like intimidated, but also like curious. And Vanessa was like, I'll do the talking. And I was like, perfect. So that was great. And I showed up. And then I saw it. Being a sexuality health educator with Planned Parenthood, we're usually organized by county. So like I have a whole county and like I can go to the next county and meet that educator and be like, hi. But we're kind of siloed, separated, even statewide, it's just not a cohesive community. However, there's a lot of reception of the work that we do, that we really like, we need each other. We need that close community, and we like make time to like create those spaces where we can like learn from each other, but also where we can like rant and like be understood in the journeys or the really similar pathways that we're on. And so when I got here, I saw it. It was like, I was like, oh, this is this is kind of the same. And the only way that my colleagues and I have described it is like, all of your senses are drooling for each other. Like that's the presence. It's like some of it, it's in our eyes. Like, I've never seen someone as colorful and vibrant as Vanessa, or I've never seen someone like take like an earlier workshop I was in was talking about like Latin and LGBT like classroom curriculum. Like I've never seen those things, or I've never heard them, and it was just like really, that like grounded me. I was like, okay, cool. Like this is the thing that we're all looking for. And earlier, or last night, last evening on the panel, a conversation around like intersectionality happened. And I love talking about intersectionality. I think like most of the time, those conversations are around how different systems of oppression overlap or affect each other or build on each other or do stuff. And that's really important. I think like Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins are two people who have like pushed that definition forward in like a bigger sense of like how we can apply it. And in these contexts, my favorite way to think and look around intersectionality is like, not only are there systems of oppressions overlapping, supporting each other, learning from each other, but there's that counterculture. There's the people doing the work in a bunch of different ways, responding to the ever-growing, adaptable, flexible kind of like oppression that can affect us as communities. And like honoring those ways that we are all showing up to face these different problems and like seeing where those things connect is like really important for me because I'm weird and I don't think that most people do the same work that I do. And I had to like I had to ground myself in the fact that like my work is going to connect with Vanessa's work, or my work is going to connect with my colleagues' work, and we can help bolster each other and like have that open mind of experience and expression of like what it means to find justice, maybe. So I'm super excited. What's going to happen in the next 5 minutes, maybe, if I talk that long, is that I just want us as a group to have a discussion about some of the things that Vanessa talked about, and also some questions that like I've developed pre this workshop, but also like as Vanessa was talking, I scribbled some down. Is there something that I need to say? Oh, and something that really helps me, I really like astrology, so I'm a Virgo moon and like figuring out stuff, like I like frameworks. And so we did pass out this Venn diagram. This is one of my favorite things in the whole wide world to do for like anything in my life, which is a Venn diagram. Is someone missing?
I just want to make sure.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So this is something that my manager did for me once, and it was pretty dang cool because I was like freaking out. And I had a lot of anxiety, and my manager Lacey was like, all right, we're gonna make a Venn diagram. And I was like, okay. And they're like, this side is the things out of your control. And I was like, oh. And this side is the things in your control. And I was like, oh. And then we're gonna rip that out of your control bubble, like off, like just rip it, put it somewhere else. And we're gonna think about the ways that you have control, that you have power, that you want to express and access kind of like your own work and your own self. And then in the middle, we're gonna explore ideas for like collaboration, where I can connect my work with the things out of my control. Where can I ask for advocacy? Where can I ask for funding? All of the logistical and dreamlike idealizations of like what you wanna see in the world. So like, we offer this to you in a response of the question of this conference, right? How do I make this field more inclusive, more accessible, more trauma-informed? Like, what is the goal and like, how are you gonna do it? And we know that this is an institution connected to a larger government, and there are some things that are out of our control. And that's okay to acknowledge, but like the focus should really be in that middle or in those things in your control. So always have to offer a framework. You're welcome to fill it out like anytime, like as we talk, and you're welcome to just like leave it blank, and when the time strikes right, be like, okay, I need that Venn diagram right now, because what is in my control? Okay, I'm gonna ask a question, and then I want y'all to answer it out loud. You can raise your hand, but hopefully we'll like get in a groove where we're just like talking to each other. I'm most comfortable in a room where all the chairs are in a circle, so this is a little new for me. So thank you for folks turning and listening, and this is a stationary mic, so I will try to repeat things if they like haven't been heard, but also like if you could really amplify your voice, that would also be really cool. Okay. I'm going to start with this first question. And when I ask a question, like, please, it's okay to have a response that doesn't answer my question. Does that make sense? I just want to like strike the thoughts, the brainstorm of thoughts and ideas. But this is a question that I've had ever since Vanessa was like, this is what I want to do. And so when we were like talking and planning and working through this workshop, I was like, okay, like we want to make this inclusive. And you're talking about the counterculture, counter narrative that exists out of exclusivity, right? And so I'm like, okay, well, then how do we remain accountable or responsible or I don't know, ethical is I don't know if that's what I'm asking, but like as we acknowledge the countercultures and counter narratives that were born out of exclusivity, and invite them in, and honor the work that they're doing, and like how that like I don't know, I have that same question for Vanessa, right? Like when she's writing about these Black feminist women, I'm like, awesome. Now, like how do we like really honor them, and how do we make how do we make that assertion of like contributing within or not within the walls of academia? So this doesn't have to be specific to the field. Just in general, like how do we also think about the folks who have been excluded and done this work anyway? And how do we invite them in? And how do we hold ourselves accountable to what that looks like? And then I get to be a facilitator and ask Vanessa to answer first.
This is hard.
Yeah.
I think like, at least for me, a lot of the talks like genuinely are around like acknowledgement, and that for me looks very specific. I think there's too often a lot of the work and like the depth of the work, especially with Black female writers, tends to get ignored. Just sort of like, oh, it's great, she's this, and just sort of like the one aspect. And it was actually like through just kind of like continuously looking at like the same displays of Zora Neale Hurston on like Barnard and Columbia's campus. So I was like, wait, she did so much more. Like what? Like what kind of acknowledgement is this? And so I think like, for me, one thing that I really want to do is draw out the way these women contributed, or a lot of the ways in which they contributed are still now being named. So like a lot of their engagement with like ancient myths, it's like in the past decade, people are like, oh, they're classicists. It's a lot of like Zora Neale Hurston's work in the South, like studying folklore, that people are now like, oh, she's an ethnomusicologist. And so really pushing to be like very specific in like detailing the work and narratives of these women. That's something I want to push forward.
Other thoughts?
I have a thought, just on the top of my mind listening to your response. So for example, in coursework, especially early on in Latin courses, I can remember hearing a ton about like Paradise Lost, right? Like this pops up over and over again. In similar works by mostly white men, and the reception as it has been controlled by white men. And I think very specifically, we have to take a accountability in the classroom when we're teaching, and we can't leave out these important authors like Zora Hurston and Toni Morrison. So maybe we talk a little less about Paradise Lost and bring in other works into the conversation. That's a good place to start.
Okay, I'm gonna work down the line.
Okay.
I think that the biggest problem, okay, well, there's 1,000 problems, I'm gonna pick one. I think the biggest problem is the shift from assimilation versus inclusion. And I think that we've got like the olden days, the melting pot versus the fishing bowl. Like, I know, we all know from history of the 20th century that assimilation, oh, that's the answer, and it's safe and it's comfortable. And it's like, people don't necessarily know how to turn it into, like, why don't we fit in the box? Like, well, we need everything to fit in the box, like, and our educational system is still very heavy on that, like, well, why isn't it fitting in this box? Like, it's so nice and safe when it's assimilation, and like, why? And so I think there's a big problem that a lot of people still think that inclusion equals assimilation. Because there's so many cool voices out there, but there's, but like, oh, but I need, I have to do it this way because that's the way that it's always been. And it's so, and like, I feel like that inertia, and like, I mean, we've spent like so long in that one mode that it's really hard. That's something like, oh, hey, why not, instead of Paradise Lost, this voice that isn't a dead white man. It's like, well, that's radical, but like, why is an 18th century woman poet a radical idea? Like, I mean, she's been dead 200 years. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, and I think it's really hard, and I think it's really good to be making a new step in that direction.
Yeah, totally. Like, I have like seen that shift from like assimilation to inclusivity to like neutrality. Like, I'm so neutral, everyone can come, and it's like, well, that doesn't quite work either. Yeah, say something.
So I was thinking about this, the first session yesterday on critical classical reception, and sort of how to actually incorporate this into a curriculum. I think it's important to ask who are we imagining to be doing this work of sort of bringing in these countercultural narratives. Often it falls to people who have been traditionally excluded from these fields, and that's a lot of emotional labor to take on. And then it sort of just exists in these pockets, and it's sort of on those people to keep feeding it and doing it. So yeah, I mean, something like a sort of, either for people who are in training, students, like some courses, they're like a pro seminar in this sort of stuff, because like I knew all this stuff about Thomas Jefferson, like all of racism growing up in Virginia, did not know about Phyllis Wheatley, which is like on me, so thank you. But like that is something that like that absolutely has to be there from like, I mean, middle school onwards, even if it's not about like classics, like that's an important part of like American history. And those two need to be sort of in conversation together.
Yes. So I like this conference and many other conferences before this have made me think that like the future of classics is really like in reception, and also like shifting our courses to not be like, I've taught a lot of like Roman history and like Roman civilization courses and like literature and translation, and we think like less chronologically about like the Roman world and like its influence, and we actually like structure our courses so they're more thematic. We can bring in like receptions more. Like whenever I teach Roman civilization, it's Roman civilization and its receptions, right? I never just teach Roman civilization completely, and I don't follow like Roman historical chronology. It's all about like military conquest and the like. And if we like focus thematically on like women in antiquity and like slaves in antiquity, and we can really bring in like other perspectives. And whenever I read the Aeneid, for example, like I read like receptions of the Aeneid, like feminist receptions of the Aeneid. And whenever I read Medea, I read Beloved, right? And and if we stop thinking of things like as chronological and more thematic, I think there's room for all of this. And a lot of students come into classics with these preconceived notions about it, and we can really like in our classes, if we have control work, we can like really append those expectations. And sometimes they don't have any expectations at all, and sometimes we're like, wow, that was a receptions course, that's so cool.
Yeah.
And also with like Latin, if we like move outside of like 476 CE and really think about like Latin as like a continuing lingua franca of the 19th century, you can really bring in all these different perspectives, not just like politically. Does her poetry survive her Latin poetry?
Yeah, there's some chunks of in the I should have my timeline from it. But on the books on the back, in African American. Oh, thank you. Tracy Walters, African American Literature and the Gospel Tradition.
And so they're excerpts.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like you think of like Latin not just as like ending in 476 CE, and really we can really bring in all these different perspectives. There's a lot of like Latin from South America in the 18th and 19th century, and we can start reading that in our classrooms rather than we have to read Kikaro. That's the only thing we can read.
Yeah, it was like reminding me of a point in my undergrad when I was like, oh, this history is happening at the same time as this history?
Yeah.
I never thought of that. I was like, why did we teach it that way? Anyway, I won't come back to you. Go ahead.
I think related to that, one of the particular factors that problematizes the issue is the idea of formal versus informal pedagogy. Because the problem is that official formal academia is like a top. The minute it loses its centrality, it'll collapse under its own weight.
Yeah.
And so because of that, as has been mentioned, the minute one introduces the slightly what's considered to be a theory moving from the center, like say the possibility of native Egyptian and Nubian populations mixing with the Ptolemaic royal family, thus producing a mixed dynasty, suddenly someone's Afrocentric. So if one say tries to bring that in, so sure, perhaps someone will be possible to briefly replace Paradise Lost with the Epic of Gilgamesh and Letham, but then there's still the question of how much the teacher will be devoted to actually encouraging students to explore those connections outside of the classroom, let alone to somehow invert the chronology of epic history as academia tends to somehow see the Epic of Gilgamesh as an offshoot of the Oresteia. So I think,
damn.
So in that sense, I think it might be perhaps just as important to focus less on changing the exact curriculum and more changing the way that we prepare particular students to respond to it, and thus creating more private spaces where people can interact and dissect and deconstruct this without having the official formal structure breathing down their neck to conform it to sort of preconceived standards.
Oh my gosh. When I became a sex ed teacher, I was like, easy. This is talking about STI and birth control methods. But then I discovered I had another task, and it's kind of like to care. And I was like, whoa, like, how do I bring that like into my work in an ethical way, right? Like sexuality is like very abound with like values that like get to be vast and diverse. But like I needed to like reform and name that task and commit to it. I love that. Also, Vanessa loves Oresteia, so I'm like, what? I want to way more about that. Okay, yes.
I feel like it's important, like Vanessa said, to work on like realizing, like, dang it, it's
You got there.
So many people.
Yeah.
That to focus on recognizing the work that Black women did in the past, and I feel like we should like do one better, one up that. Recognize the work that Black women are doing in the present, because especially I feel like in class, for example, I would say something and it might be a little bit controversial, and then people will be quiet. It makes me feel like I said something wrong. I pushed the envelope. But then people after class will come up to me quietly and said, I liked what you said. I thought that was interesting, but like, why didn't you back me up in class? And these are people that consider themselves allies, and like, I don't fault them, but I said, if I'm putting myself out there and I'm constantly the one pushing the envelope, making a scene, and you're quietly supporting from the background, and then later on saying, oh yeah, I agree with you, it's like, you realize afterwards the value of my words. I'm like, okay, maybe. And it's the same thing, but like now we're only recognizing the value, and I feel like people are gonna keep perpetrating that unless they realize to stand up and like support people right now, especially Black women, because it's, especially in classes, I've been told that I get too loud, too intense, too heated, and often I'm saying the things that, for example, my white colleagues would say, especially white male colleagues, but I'm the only one who's being labeled as causing like chaos, and the same exact people will come to me afterwards, or even the professor will come to me afterwards and says, I like what you're saying, it's just that it's a little bit too much.
Thank you for sharing that. Like, those experiences are not always easy to just talk about in a large group. And it definitely reminds me of, like, you know, conversations that Vanessa and I have had specifically around like collective community and individualism, and like where those things are like, how those things are prioritized in academia and work and production and capitalism and all those fun things. So like as a collective of like students, of learners, of classicists, of ancientists, there's like work to support others. And so thank you for sharing that. Okay, I'm gonna go back. Yes, there.
Your comment about assimilation made me think about the history of appropriation, and also just so like if I'm going to do the work of including Black women writers or something else in my curriculum, am I doing it in a way that is putting them forward to benefit classics and draw attention to them, and interrogating myself to make sure I'm not doing it just to be like cool in a sense, right? Like, so yeah.
Yes. Sorry. Yes. Okay. Oh, wait. Yes. You. Yes. I love
Hi.
your sweater.
Okay.
That's great.
That's you.
Okay. So hi, my name is Tina. So I was really struck by Vanessa's point about feeling like Cassandra, and I was really, I was like, that's terrible. And then as I don't know your name, Samuel was talking, I had another image from classical mythology, like Sisyphus, who's constantly sort of pushing this boulder up the hill, and then it rolls back. And I don't claim that I can take either of those positions, but when I do the work, like even in my own writing, this need that we have in the field of constantly making sure that we're citing our sources, and did I cite this really important person who did this work? And I sometimes feel like I'm being buried in like the need of the field to constantly sort of validate itself by going back to the people who've already said the thing, rather than just saying the fucking thing. And so like that, and so my question, how can we do this more ethically and right, and being more honest about what we're doing, and like sometimes, and what you said, right, like is it really radical when I'm doing that thing? Like in some ways in the field of classics it can feel that way, to kind of say, actually, like all of these important people and professors and universities that can't, right? Like it can feel really radical to say, I'm going to set that aside, like if you want to take a course in that thing, go over there. The course that you're going to get in this particular space with me or with other teachers, that's going to be about this material, right? And then sort of echoing what you said, when I'm including Phyllis Wheatley in my materials, when I talk about Du Bois and other authors, like acknowledging at the beginning of the class, like the course, my name is Tina, I'm a white middle-aged cis queer lady from Germany, and these other things, like just to be really upfront right away. This is who I am. These are my sort of blind spots. This is hopefully what you're going to get in the course. And if you want something else, you can go over there, or you can do your own thing. So, yes, thank you.
Totally, yeah. I would say that sexuality is a pretty newer field of study, so there's a lot of just saying stuff. For better or for worse. And when Vanessa and I were talking to me, like, this statement, I'm like, cool, it's like from these 8 sources. Right, yes. So I definitely, okay, here, and then.
Hey, I'm Ashley. My youngest students are 10, and so I teach middle school. And after yesterday, I was like, most of last night, I was like, okay. So not that I didn't realize this, but I'm probably one of the first people that's introducing them to what classes looks like, and I take that very seriously.
Yeah.
And I have a lot more thoughts now from listening to all of you, so I'm going to try to be reasonably concise. But one thing is, the idea of why do we have to introduce one source before we introduce another source? Like, there seems to be because I'm assigning them in various levels of appropriateness to know about what's happening with the Benin ivories that and the quest to return everything to Africa as swiftly as possible, and the problems that have been happening with that. And then I had this thought last week where I'm like, well, I haven't talked to this class about the Parthenon marbles yet. And I said, well, why do I have to talk about them first? It's like, I'm doing the need first. And then we can talk about these other things that also relate to that from around the world. The other thing is, so like kind of, it's something that Samuel said about, I can't remember how you put it, but it was really good. Like something about like formal and informal or something like that. And that struck me, I don't know if this is how you meant it, but like, why can't I be just teaching the dictee, which was in a talk yesterday, or Phyllis Wheatley, to teach them rather than saying, and now let us compare them to what Cicero said. Like it could just be something I can teach. I started my year in 7th and 8th grade having them watch a really great TED Talk by Titus Kaphar, who's a wonderful artist if you don't know him. And it's about basically shifting the gaze, and that his work is trying to shift the gaze from, like in portraits, from one person to another, from one place to another, and I couldn't tell if it landed, and I basically was like, well, I don't know, I'm gonna have them write a reflection on it, because you can't always tell middle schoolers, sometimes it just hurt you, and it's like, okay, well, sometimes you don't know unless they write, and similar to kind of what this person in the front was saying, and I don't remember your name, I'm sorry, about people coming up to you after class saying, I really appreciated what you said. I had a lot of kids who say very little in class, which is fine, because that was me, saying, I really appreciated that you started with this, and these are all the things that I think about it, and this is the way that I think that we can move forward. So the idea of not just including more and doing it differently, but also pedagogically giving kids different ways to respond, because you're not always going to know based on like how they look at you in class. So, I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, yes, I understand. I'm thinking about being a sex ed teacher in middle school, and yeah, they'll just look at you.
So a couple of things. First, that was an awesome. I walked in late, but that was still great, Vanessa. And I want to echo the point about people saying that someone's loud and like criticizing people because they have opinions. So I want to share an experience I had where I was the faculty member, and there was one other student of color in the class, and the rest of the class was white. And I got, and she was a young Latinx woman, and she actually was commuting from a different college to take this class. So she, like, her outsider status was quite magnified. So she would say things that her white heteronormative classmates didn't agree with, and I would try actively to support her in class. And one of the strangest things that ever happened to me in terms of my like academic career was I got criticized for not controlling the class enough, or allowing an individual to disrupt the class. And I had 3 white male students come to me and say, can you do something about this in my office hours? And this was like one of the most deeply unsettling things that I've ever been confronted with. And so I share that, and like that, it's such a crappy situation to be in, even when you have allies. And I felt even worse for her. She knew, like, they were staring at her, they were like texting each other in class. I could see them on their phones texting each other about the things this girl was saying, and it was heartbreaking to teach a class like that. And the last thing I want to kind of point to is the version of the classical tradition that we consider traditional, that's an act of reception. So I think if we say that in and of itself is an act of reception, why do we have to even ask about bringing this stuff in, right? We have, the classical tradition is infinite receptions, right? And we have to pick certain areas, right? And there's no reason we should pick this 19th century Anglo-German white male version, right? There's no reason to do that.
Yeah, this is something I've been struggling with a lot in doing reception work. And this is, I think you mentioned this before, but something about appropriation in terms of not wanting, like, classics is very historically tied up with empire and with colonialization and imperialism, and not wanting our field to go putting our hands all over other, we're like, oh, Toni Morrison is classics. And in a way that, like, I don't know if she wants to, she would have wanted to be, our field has a lot of problems. I don't know. And so thinking about how to do this in a way that is ethical, it says like these are really important receptions to this work, but also there are good reasons why people work and artists and things might not want to be filed under like classics when we want to talk about, Toni Morrison is doing some of the most brilliant reception work out there. Her work is brilliant, and at the same time, I don't want to introduce it as in a way that is going to feel appropriative, especially because like my classes are mostly white, and I don't know how to do this well. It's something I think about a lot and I wrestle with in terms of not being appropriative, and I don't know what the answer is, but you give me a lot to think about. That says something.
Yeah, I feel that struggle in terms of I reach to classicists for sexuality studies, but I wouldn't call y'all sexologists unless you really wanted to be. But I use so much of that information from ancient studies to try to understand some of these concepts. So yeah, I totally get that.
If I heard what you were saying, Amy, and so I teach middle school mostly, and I have a really diverse group of students. And I confess I'd never heard before today that Phyllis Wheatley wrote in Latin. So thank you, Vanessa, because my students are going to be reading that 40 years out for sure, in some fashion, because I want them to see that this field is for everyone. Here's an example of how it could be for lots of different kinds of people. And I'd also like to be able to say, and I don't know if it's not using the label, but to say, and I work in DC, so to talk about, someone who was at Howard and say, and by the way, she did study some classics. Is that appropriation, or is it acknowledgement and credit? Not to say she was a classicist, but to say, well, she studied the classics. And I don't know if that's just semantics, and I'm just trying to avoid it. But I would hope for the sake of my students, they could say, this is someone that looks, someone who's more like me than their teacher is.
I just want to really quickly. Classics does appropriate strongly, so it's pretty apparent when it happens. But also it's I meant to mention this at the very end of my thing, but classics was one of the first times I heard in academia the phrases embodiment, code switch, and a lot of the phrases, and this sort of came up in the panel last night when Stephanie asked does anyone know where intersectional comes from, or provide the answer. A lot of things do come from the Black community, Black scholarship, Black resources, and then get entered into the broader zeitgeist, and then certain fields, and unfortunately classics tends to be one of the worst ones, will like kind of scoop up things, and not like really want to engage with them, but kind of make eidolons of them, and just like, this is the classics version of this thing. So I think like having a lot of intentionality of not trying to white classics wash it, can go a long way.
Totally, because like there's that, yeah, like intent, woo, and then just like owning your impact, because maybe that didn't work for someone, and like that's, it's like not okay, but it's also okay, like that's just gonna happen.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Cindy Calder. I also teach middle school and high school, and in terms of this in control versus out of control scenario, feeling very much under the oppression of control, I started my own program, which I run in summer called Culture Classics. And I have slowly but surely evolved it so that now I have a creative writing pod that's outside of just, you know, to entice students to come first, trust me, believe that this is going to help them with their AP and SAT and all that. And then slowly but surely develop little pods that are now offshoots of the study of classics and that allow for all sorts of study outside of a structured environment. People are afraid to say things about powers that be. So I invite anybody to offer a suggestion to me. I've been slowly doing this. Any teachers who want to throw an idea at me and say, this is what I'd like to do, and I'd like to take it out of the classroom, and I'd like to join with you and do some sort of interdisciplinary work. I have a platform. It's now 9 years old, so I feel, that I can really hopefully make some advancements. And any of you in this room are welcome to submit, just talk to me.
What's your name again?
Cindy Calder, CILDE. You can find me online.
We are at about time, and if you, a couple minutes, if there, if there's a last question, or something, but we're technically at time.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I know Vanessa and Forever in a different context. I don't know anything about classes really, but like I was thinking about like inclusivity and how Zora, she was, part of the Harlem Renaissance and like part of this rich culture in Harlem, and like what is the classics department doing to really connect with the Harlem community and this generation and like bring in right, like not a lot, but like bring in like youth into the classics and like teach them that like this is for them, this is something that they can like see themselves in, is really, I think, really important. And like I think about access and like how the typical student that comes to the classics department isn't going to look like a kid from Harlem. So like how do we like make a group that like kids can actually be learning about this stuff in a womanist perspective and like and all these things. So I was thinking about that.
Reflective community. Pretty cool. Well, I'll say thank you. And sometimes the work is just bearing witness and hearing each other. So I really appreciate all of you.
Thank you.